Okay. Well, I just want to say hello to everybody, and on behalf of everybody at Warner Brothers Entertainment, I can't tell you how honored I was when our corporate community outreach division called me up and they said, would you be interested in interviewing David Thompson about his new book about Warner Brothers? And I was thrilled to say, absolutely, because not only am I passionate about the company for which I am honored to work and have been for 20 years, thank God, but more importantly, David and I had just had an interview for our Warner Archive podcast, which you can get free on iTunes every week if you want. And as soon as I heard that David had written this book as part of the Jewish Lives series for the Yale University Press, I naturally went out and got a copy because I like to have every book that's ever been written about movies, period, but especially about Warner Brothers. And I think, in my humble opinion, I have all of them, I think David has written the finest, most eloquent book on the history of our very wonderful studio. And it is a great honor to be with you today and here at the Burbank Public Library to talk about your new book.
I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you, David. My first question, and I think this is a question that everybody would have, is how did this particular book in the Jewish Lives series from Yale come about? And did you select the Warner Brothers, or how did that all come to be?
Well, I had done a book for Yale a few years ago, and we got on fine. And they came to me and said, do you know about the Jewish Lives series? And I said, sure, I've heard about it. And they said, well, we think we'd like to do a movie Jewish life. And can you think of topics that might interest you? And I suggested one or two names, and for various reasons, they didn't quite work. They had someone else writing one of them, so that was no good. And then they came to me and they said, what about Warner Brothers? And that took me aback because all the previous Jewish Lives had been about individuals, and they'd never done anything about a corporation or a family, really. And I straight away was excited because I knew enough about the four brothers who were the brothers to know there was a terrific story there. But I did say to them, and I hope you'll bear with this, I did say, you know, you've done a great many of these Jewish Lives about really noble, distinguished careers, like Freud and Kafka and Einstein, you know, people who loom very large in our history and our culture. And while I'm fond of the Warner Brothers individually, I couldn't honestly tell you that nobility was their forte. And they said, so? Which I thought was very enlightened. And so we set off on that path, on that sort of understanding, and the result is here, the book. But that's how it came about. And you know, working with them was very pleasant. They were, I thought, stingy about the number of illustrations they would do in the book. I would have liked there to be a lot more illustrations. And if anyone's inclined to sponsor an illustrated edition, a proper illustrated edition, I would be up for that. But it was very good working with them, and one of the offshoots of that is arranging this event.
And I think one of the things that I love about the book is, maybe it's because I'm used to seeing the images and have been living with the images for so long, but I was cherishing the text. I was cherishing your words. And this book is less than 200 pages of your text, is that correct?
The target was to do the book in 60,000 words. That was what I was aiming at, yeah.
So what really I found remarkable, and what you will find remarkable when you read this book, and I urge you to please read this book, is that you managed to capture basically over 100 years of Warner Brothers history, but really focusing in on a very particular time, the growth of the Warner Brothers family, their foray as immigrants into exhibitors, and then finally forming the company that thrives down the street today with the big tower.
Yeah, and I did say, as we talked about it in advance, that I didn't really feel it would be right to push the story beyond the death of the brothers. I mean, obviously Warner Brothers are out there still, and they make a lot of very good films. But no one could claim, I think, that the character that existed under the brothers is exactly what's there now. It's changed, as all movie studios have changed. Most of the movie studios have faded away. So it was a book that would end really with the decline and death of Jack, who was the one who lasted the longest, and who I think was really unquestionably the most significant and influential.
So if you would be so kind, give our audience a little of the background of the Warner Brothers and their immigration to the United States.
Well, they came from a small village in what was either Poland or Russia. At that time, that part of the world was in great flux. And three of them, Harry, Sam, Albert, were born there. And the family came to North America. And Jack was actually born, he's the youngest, he was born in Canada. But you would have to say that between them, they did not have a great deal of education. They were not impoverished, because you couldn't really come here if you were impoverished. You had to pay for your passage. But they were not well off. And they were very, very far from the kind of level at which their lives would settle later on. And they came here, and they came to the Midwest, Ohio particularly, and in the early years of the 20th century, they sort of messed around. They were looking for a way of making a living and of getting ahead and being successes. I think they all wanted to be successes. And they did many things. They were in the meat business and the shoe business. I think they were in the bowling alley business for a time. I think they would try anything. And because this was a brand new craze in the early 20th century, they thought about movies, and they started, in the way many of the moguls did start, running what were called really film exchanges, places where theaters could go to get a movie to play. So they brought in films and then they leased them out. And it was a tough business. There was a lot of competition, and it was a fairly unscrupulous business. It had many connections with the underworld. There was a lot of violence involved in it. But like many of the people who were in the exchange business, they reached a point where they said, a lot of these films are no good that we're selling. And certainly true. And they thought, well, maybe we should make the films ourselves, because then we've got a more guaranteed supply. So they began, and for a long time, relatively speaking, they were way behind MGM, Paramount, Universal. in the 20s, the middle 20s, I think they would have folded, but for the greatest star they had of that time, who had 4 legs. And you probably know who that is. It's Rin Tin Tin. And the Warners said he paid the mortgage and did some really wonderfully exuberant films. If you haven't seen a Rin Tin Tin film, I urge you to go see it. They are quite something. And it's a measure of those films that a lot of people believe that Rin Tin Tin should have won the Best Actor award the first year the Oscars were presented. And he was written in on a lot of ballots, but the Academy, in its snooty, respectable way, said, no, we can't give it to a dog. We're giving it to Emil Jannings instead. But that's a measure of how people loved Rinty, you know. And of course, what really drove Warner Brothers into their future and what changed the business was that they were the first studio to really get sound talking on film. And it was a tough haul, and Sam Warner, one of the brothers, died in the process. The brothers all said, oh, he worked so hard to get sound. He just wore himself out, and he died because of that. If you look closely into what happened, you do discover that he had a head full of rotten teeth, and I think that had something to do with his death. But the Warner Brothers told stories, and they told legends from the beginning. So Sam is now still regarded as the man who introduced sound and suffered for it. But sound set them off, and key figure in those early years is a man who is actually always associated with another studio. But the head of production at Warner Brothers from the late 20s through to 1933 was Darryl F. Zanuck, who was a writer and a producer. And Zanuck, I think, had a lot to do with the things we most associate with Warner's, the gangster films, the musicals, the social problem pictures.
And didn't he really bring Rin Tin Tin to the Warner
Oh,
Brothers?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was a very shrewd man, and he had terrific drive and energy, and I try to give him great credit in the book. He was a rascal, you know, and lived to become a rascal in history, and a lot of people tell very bad stories about it, but a lot of people tell terrible stories about most of the people who have run the movie business. And I think we have to live with them. We have to accept.
And it's been my experience that you'll also hear wonderful stories about those same people in most cases. I know a lot of people have things to say about each of the Warner brothers, but the one that they talk about the least is Sam, because he passed away.
He died early, yeah.
He died the night before the premiere of The Jazz Singer.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting situation, and I shared this with David when we had our phone interview. About 10 years ago, we were preparing a restoration of The Jazz Singer for its 80th anniversary. This year is its 90th anniversary. And we made a documentary called The Dawn of Sound: How Movies Learn to Talk. And I worked on that documentary with my colleagues, and we had 16 different cuts before we finished the documentary. And I felt that I was going to be like Sam Warner. Am I going to live through making this film? But happily, it did come together, and it is part of the DVD, and I think it does. I was in a supervisory role. I didn't make the film, so I can speak objectively that the people who did make the film did a wonderful job of really capturing that rush to sound and the competitive processes. But Sam Warner was the hero.
Yeah. You have very good teeth, though.
I'm very fortunate for that. I also, take my vitamins. But I want to ask you about Harry, Albert, and Jack, the other three brothers, and how they interacted as the company became successful and moved from Sunset Boulevard to Burbank. which is why we're here.
Well, Harry, the oldest, was certainly regarded as the head of the family for a long time by the others. Harry was very serious. I think he wanted to be respected, so he was all for leading a very respectable life. He was the most devout of the four, although I don't think any of them were fiercely Jewish. And this is very interesting because I think Harry, for one, did not want the Warners to be thought to be Jewish, because in those days there was a very strong tendency among those people who disapproved of the movies, and a lot of people did. They thought they were very, very bad for young people. They may have been right. But it was easily identified as a Jewish business, Jewish conspiracy even, that was sort of doing America down. You know, we live in a moment when that kind of thought is being quite widely expressed anyway. Not about Jews, or not about Jews yet, but people who are not American. I'm not American. So Harry was cautious about defining the character, but he was the head of the family for a long time. Albert, I have to say, in all my research, I could find almost nothing about Albert. Albert was officially the treasurer of the company, and he sat in his office reading horse racing form. Later on in life, he was very keen to watch television. And one of the stories told about him is that he might invite you to dinner sometimes, but he got impatient if everyone wasn't there, and he would sometimes sit down and start his dinner before the guests arrived. I think he was a blunt, simple man. He was the fourth brother, really. Sam, we've talked about. He was the man who really pioneered sound. That leaves Jack, the youngest. And Jack was a thorn in Harry's flesh, because Jack was never going to be respectable. Jack liked to tell funny stories. He would dominate a meeting by trying to get everyone cracked up with laughter. He also fancied himself as a singer, so he would sing to people in meetings, that kind of thing. There may be some executives around now who do that, I don't know. And he led a pretty scandalous life. He got a divorce, he got remarried. Harry thought that was shocking, because the second wife, before she became the second wife, moved in with him before the divorce of the first marriage. And even then, Jack had an eye for any other woman who might cross his path. He was a womanizer. He was a tough dealer. And in the end, and you would have to get the book to read this, he really screwed Harry in a big financial way. So Harry and Jack were at war. And the family sort of took sides around it, although really most people backed Harry. Jack did not have a lot of support. The people who worked for Jack, people like Cagney and Bogart and Betty Davis, did not like him at all, and spoke badly about him. And there were many stories about how awful Jack was, and there's substance to them all. But Jack had incredible instincts. And I think if you believe, as I do, that one of the great things about Warner Brothers is the amount of talent they got and used, I think that was Jack. And I'll give you just one example of that. Joan Crawford had had a long career at MGM. And she and that studio wearied of each other eventually in the early 40s, and they agreed to part. She was really fired, that's what it came to, and she was at an age where it was not easy for an actress to reestablish herself. And immediately, Jack approached her and said, will you come to Warner's? And Warner's was never a studio that really did well by actresses. And I think Joan said, well, what would I do? And Jack said, well, you're a bit older. You've got a rueful look in your eyes. She'd been very beautiful as a young woman, but that turned, as I think many of us know, in Joan, and she became a wounded person. And Jack said, I've got this project that I think is made for you, Mildred Pierce. So they made Mildred Pierce. Joan won her Oscar. Film was a big hit, and her career, for a few years anyway, really came back to life again. And there are many stories like that about Jack, which are really a matter of instinct and an ability to assess people and know that they would work. Bogart at Warner's really changed his character as an actor. And there were other people who had to do with that, John Huston, Howard Hawks, Lauren Bacall. But I think Jack was part of it too. And I think he was a rascal. I say in the book that he is the biggest scumbag ever to get into the Jewish Live series, and I stand by that. But he had something that everybody who's been through Warner's or any studio knows. He had incredible instincts. And if anyone made that studio, I would say it was Jack.
I mean, my personal take on it has been that Warner Brothers films from the golden age, from the 30s and 40s and early 50s, have aged better than any other studio.
I totally agree. I say in the book that I think it was the best studio there ever was. And one test of that is that the films stand up. There is a season of Warner's films going on at the moment at the Stanford Theater in Palo Alto. It's 67 films in 12 weeks. And I've been down there to see some of them. And let me tell you that Labor Day weekend, they showed Casablanca, and they had over 2,000 people in that weekend. I doubt there were many theaters in America that weekend that sold more than 2,000 tickets. And people are just amazed at the films because they've dated in a certain way. You know, they're films from the 30s and so on, and there are some ideas and lines that are from that period, but they still work. They are amazing entertainments.
And Casablanca is, rather than going back to the silent days and the Nickelodeon days, you start off your book after you establish a little bit about the brothers, talking about the miracle of Casablanca and how it all came together somewhat accidentally.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody was totally in charge of it. And one of the interesting things about any studio, I think, in those days was that the whole theory of the director as the auteur and the shaper of it all, it doesn't stand up. Warner Brothers films were collaborations. You have to remember that the craftspeople and the actors had worked together so many times. They knew how to photograph Cagney. You know, one reason the films got made quickly and cheaply was because the lights were there waiting for Cagney, because he'd only finished a film 2 weeks before on the same set. That kind of quality of collaboration was important. And another thing Warner's did, they had an extraordinary core of producers. Zanuck would have been the first, Hal Wallace was another, but there were people like Robert Lord, Henry Blanke, Jerry Wald, Mark Hellinger, and these guys were experts at what they did, and they put these films together. And I don't think there's a director at Warner Brothers in those years that you can absolutely say, he directed that. It's his film, bar one case, Busby Berkeley. Busby Berkeley was the usually dance director on the film, not actual director, but you know a Busby Berkeley film when you see it. There is the extraordinary flowering of obsession in his films, and flower imagery is very much a part of it.
And there's a very famous story that one of our sound stages is higher than any of the other. And that's because Busby Berkeley wanted to raise the camera higher, higher. And so we can't go, then raise the roof. And they did. So if anybody takes our wonderful tour, and I don't want to be a shill, but we have a great studio tour that's gotten even better. And the tour guides really know their stuff, and they will show you all those sound stages, and particularly point out the one with the roof that Busby Berkeley raised. I think one of the things that I've also noted about Jack Warner is he did have good taste when it came to acquiring properties. And especially in the later years, after he kind of seized control, and you can talk about that a little bit in a moment, but he went after things like very big Broadway plays and musicals, Auntie Mame, The Music Man, Gypsy, and then most notably he got his last Oscar for My Fair Lady in the second worst deal in the history of show business, the first being the Time Warner AOL merger, which I'm still recovering from. But Jack Warner bought the rights to make My Fair Lady for $5.5 million in 1961 before they shot a foot of film. And then 7 years later, the rights reverted back to CBS, who had financed the Broadway show and who owns the film to this day. So that's one Oscar-winning Best Picture of Warner Brothers that we don't have in the library anymore. But Jack got an Oscar.
To your point, growing up in London, one of the first Warner Brothers films that I saw like 3 times in a week was East of Eden. And obviously, I fell for James Dean, and I'm sure there are people in this room who did. But I knew it was a novel. I bought the novel in paperback after I'd seen the film, to discover that the novel is about 5 times larger than the movie. The movie really only concentrates on the very last part of the book. It cuts a really major character, and they did the right thing. Elia Kazan was the director, and he drove the film. And of course, don't forget that James Dean's 3 feature films were all made at Warner Brothers. And I realized then that there was a real sense of books that might make movies. I have to say, I discovered during the book that Kazan went in to see Jack and said, "There's this kid, James Dean, who was making a bit of a nuisance of himself on the lot, and I think he'd be great in East of Eden, which is a fabulous novel, Jack." And Jack really said, "Do I have to read it?" I think he had a sense that Dean might be something, and he trusted Kazan, because with Kazan, they had made the movie of A Streetcar Named Desire, only a few years earlier. And let me tell you that Jack really believed that Streetcar Named Desire ought to have a happy ending. And more than that, they commissioned Lillian Hellman, no less, to write a script for it that had a happy ending. And I've seen that script. And they had the sense not to go for the happy ending. But you know, the film of Streetcar in the late 40s, 50, whenever it was, that was a pretty shocking, startling film. And again, it's his taste and instinct. And he just knew who worked. Cagney would hardly speak to him. But he made Cagney make 4 films a year. 4 films a year through the 1930s. And those are some of those 70-minute pictures very formulaic, but as fresh as can be,
agree.
as fresh as the grapefruit that went into May Clark's face.
He
in one of
tried
the-
to leave twice,
Absolutely.
and he came back.
Yeah, because he thought Jack was screwing him, and I think he was.
But what we ended up with, you start with, obviously there were pictures before it, but he hit his stride with Public Enemy in 1931,
Yeah.
and then probably one of his greatest films, White Heat, in 49.
Yeah, I mean, really one of the great Warner's films.
And yet, he left the studio right after making Yankee Doodle Dandy
Yeah.
and winning the Oscar.
Yeah, and
And
tried
if you
to be
haven't
independent.
seen Yankee Doodle Dandy recently,
Oh,
I recommend it because it, regardless of your personal politics, it makes you very proud to be an American, and it makes you very proud to
Yeah.
be living in Burbank where a movie like that was made. It was made right here.
and if someone described that film to you in advance, you would say, I don't believe it. They didn't do that. They couldn't do that, but they did. It's an extraordinary feat of daring, really.
And George M. Cohan kind of engineered the making of his life story.
Yeah.
He shopped his life story around
Yeah.
to other people, and nobody would meet his terms except Jack Warner.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's, I found it really remarkable that a lot of people overlook animation when they're talking about a studio, and I was so delighted that one of our biggest Warner Brothers stars, Mr. Bugs Bunny, got proper due in your book.
Well, getting everything into 60,000 words was tough, and a lot of stuff, and a lot of your favorite films may be left out. But I realized that I had to get animation in because it was such an extraordinary part of the studio and deeply influential. I mean, these films, they started to make them in the 30s, and you can see a direct line to modern animation. The animation is crude by the standards we know today. But Bugs Bunny was a Cagney-like figure. He was a rascal, and you couldn't trust him. And the same impulse of story is there in these 10-minute pictures. And we've been playing some of those animated films at Stanford to audiences I think had never heard of them, and they go crazy for them.
I think the thing that shocks me to this day is that most people don't know those cartoons were made to be shown in theaters
Yeah.
for adults.
Yeah.
For
Oh,
the last
absolutely.
60 years, they've been kids programming, but they were made for all audiences.
Yeah.
And I think that it's reflective of the way they relate to the movies. If you think about it, the Warner Brothers Orchestra would do a score with Max Steiner conducting or Eric Wolfgang Korngold conducting. They'd finish around 4:30, and then Carl Stalling would come in and they'd record the score for a cartoon. That same huge orchestra.
Yeah.
And that Warner Brothers sound, which is so distinctive.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I spoke about it very briefly, is the parting of Harry and Jack and the schism, if you will, of 1955-56.
Yeah. Well, Jack, the youngest, goes to the two brothers, Albert and Harry, and says, look, guys, you're getting on. You deserve to retire. You deserve to take some fruits from all you've done. You built the studio up from nothing. It's an extraordinarily profitable entity. Suppose we actually sell it to someone. And he persuaded them that that was a good move. And he said, you trust me, I'll set the deal up. So he goes away, talks to bankers, and a deal is made from which all the brothers got big sum of money. But Jack arranged the deal so that 2 days or 3 days after it had been made, he would become president of the new Warner Brothers. The very thing that Harry had said, over my dead body. And he was dead in a couple of years. And people in the family, his widow, said it broke his heart and that Jack really killed him. It was a nasty piece of work. And You have to face it for what it was.
And there's a little bit of epilogue to that story.
I'm sorry, what's that?
Well, the epilogue to the story is that when Harry had a stroke,
Oh,
and then he passed away, and Jack was in Europe
yeah, oh yeah.
at
yeah.
the time.
And did not come back for the funeral.
And a few days later, he was in a near-fatal car crash.
That's right. It's an extraordinary story. Yeah.
So when he did come back to the studio, there was a big "Welcome Back, Jack" flag over the main gate, I would say, probably on Barham.
Yeah.
And by that time, the studio had really shifted from making a few films a year to being the king, really, of the first studio to really embrace television.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Warner Brothers Television to this day is by far the leader of any studio putting programming on network television. But I had long conversation with Clint Walker, who's the star of Cheyenne.
Yeah.
And he speaks passionately. He calls me very frequently because we sell DVDs of Cheyenne, and Clint autographs them. He's 89, he's in great health, and he and his wife have a little business out of their house. He still has a very robust fan club, and he's told me that if it wasn't for Jack Warner and his support of that show and 77 Sunset Strip
That's
and
right.
all those shows, Maverick,
Yeah.
that were on ABC,
Yeah. Oh,
that
yeah.
the studio might have folded. But
Yeah.
the TV, which was run by his son-in-law,
That's right.
the
Yeah.
TV division really kept them afloat during those
Yeah.
wobbly
Yeah.
years.
And Jack really went on through most of the 1960s. He was the executive to whom Warren Beatty had to report on Bonnie and Clyde. And Jack did not understand that film one bit, because these were very different gangsters from the ones he had celebrated. And there's a story that when the picture was done, Beatty took a print up to Jack's house and showed it to him, and Jack started going to the bathroom after about 15 minutes and didn't like the film one bit. And when it was over, they had a kind of set to, and Warner said, "I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's going to work. I don't understand it." And Beatty said, "But Jack, this is a homage to Warner Brothers films." And Jack is said to have said, "What's an homage?"
Warren Beatty told me when we were working on a re-release of Bonnie and Clyde about 10 years ago that he said to Jack, "I'm so glad you put my initials on top of your water tower." And that it was a very cantankerous relationship, but clearly the time had come, and that's when Jack sold out to Seven Arts. And
just then. But it got made, you know, and it's a classic.
And I think we should talk about the fifth Warner Brother or the fourth Warner Brother, because she's mentioned all the way through your book, and that's Bette Davis.
Yeah, well, Bette is, there should be a film about Bette. I know we had the recent film about the couple making Baby Jane, but there is a story in the Bette Davis career that is just amazing. Bette Davis was a remarkable actress and a very tough woman who came to the studio that was famous, notorious for doing men's films. All their major properties were actors. And she was very unhappy there because she felt she was getting terrible material. And she was. She had won an Oscar in a film not too many people know called Dangerous, quite an interesting film. And she still got bad material. And of course, in those days, if you turned down a part, you were on a 7-year contract, you were put on suspension, and that time was added to the end of your contract. So it was like being in prison, and the sentence grew longer if you were obstreperous. And she fought it. She was a great fighter, and she crept off to Europe and signed a deal to make 2 independent films in Europe. And the Warners heard about it, and they sued her in the London courts. Big case. Attracted enormous attention. It was clear Betty was going to lose. She was in the wrong legally. But here's the measure of Jack again. Because Betty is humiliated. She's told to grow up, be like a lady, go back home and do what they tell you to do. That was the kind of world they were living in. And Jack saw that she was humiliated. He did not like her personally. He did not like her on screen. But he had the instinct that this could change her, that it was good for her to be humiliated because it would improve her and deepen her. So he paid her legal costs on the case and said, come on back, Betty, and we'll see if we can't find better parts for you. And the better parts turned into 5 Oscar nominations in 6 years. She became a major, major star. Films like Jezebel, The Letter, and I don't think that would have happened if Jack didn't have instinct and tact to know how to handle her. And, you know, she stayed at Warner's until the middle, late 40s, in fact, complaining all the time, of course. But a studio that had really been a men-only studio in many ways became notable for really the most flamboyant actress, certainly of the 1940s. And again, those films don't date. I saw The Letter in this Stanford series I've been talking about, and when Betty says she still loves the man she shot a man with whom she was having an affair because he wanted to drop her. The ferocity with which she said it made the audience gasp. I mean, that film still works as well as any film you'll see.
And there are films like Now Voyager and Old Acquaintance
Dark
and Mr.
Victory, so many of them.
Skeffington. There are so many.
Year after year.
She said that she may have lost the battle, but she won the war.
I think it's true.
And she came back. The first film she did after her exile to England was Marked Woman.
Marked Woman, which is terrific.
A terrific picture, and there's a guy in it called Bogart who plays a DA who wants to help her because she's a hostess at a nightclub.
But the coda to that story is that another Warner's actress, cooler, calmer, better educated maybe, realized she took legal advice, and she discovered that adding on time at the end of a contract system in the way they were doing was illegal under Californian state law. That broke the contract system, and that woman was Olivia de Havilland.
Who is healthy, alive, and thriving at 101.
Isn't that
God
wonderful?
bless her.
Yeah.
So, well, she's not suing us, so that makes me happy. We've had enough of that.
And also, can I personally thank George for his astuteness and in many cases knowing more than I know.
I want to talk